The shields around Thalsera were failing, and Council Speaker Rishala could see the energy readings dropping with each passing moment as she stood in the command center, watching the displays flicker and die one by one around her. The Krethics Swarm had been methodical in their destruction of the Viridian Concordance, and over the past 6 months, they had glassed 4 colonies and wiped out 2 entire species before the survivors could even understand what was happening to them. Rishala's webbed hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the communications console, and her amphibious skin had lost its normal blue-green shimmer and turned a pale gray that her people only displayed in moments of absolute terror around her. The other council members from the 7 species of the Concordance moved with the slow confusion of people who had never truly understood violence. Till it came for them directly, the Lumine representative was barely visible now, as her crystalline body had dimmed to almost nothing, and the sound of her internal resonance had dropped to a frequency that spoke of complete despair. How long until they breached the final shield layer? Rishala asked, though she already knew the answer would offer no comfort. The tactical officer was a young Viridian named Kalseth, who had learned warfare from ancient historical texts, because their people had not fought a real war in 700 years, and his voice cracked as he responded, less than 6 hours, Speaker, and once they breach it, they will bombardment the city from orbit, and we have nowhere left to evacuate the civilians. 300,000 souls lived in Thalsera, and they represented the last significant population of the Concordance. Species and below them on the planet's surface, another 2 million beings huddled in shelters that would not save them from what was coming. The Krethics did not negotiate, and they did not take prisoners, and they did not even seem to want territory. As far as the Concordance could determine, they simply destroyed everything in their path and moved on to the next system like a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or stopped. Rishala had tried everything and sent diplomatic envoys who were vaporized before they could transmit a single message, and offered surrender terms that went unanswered, and even attempted to flee to uninhabited systems, only to have the Krethics follow them with patient inevitability. The hive mind that controlled the swarm operated on principles that none of the concordant species could understand, and their ships moved with perfect coordination, and their tactics never varied because they never needed to vary against opponents who did not know how to fight back effectively. Open all communication channels, Rishala said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of accepting that this would be her final act as leader of her people. All channels, Speaker, the communications officer confirmed. Rishala took a breath and let the water in her lungs cycle through her gills one last time before she spoke into a void that she believed would offer no response. This is Council Speaker Rishala of the Viridian Concordance, broadcasting on all frequencies to anyone who can hear this transmission, and we are the last survivors of a 7-species alliance that has existed in peace for 1,000 years, and we are under attack by a hostile force we cannot defeat, and we have less than 6 hours before our final stronghold falls, and our people are exterminated. She paused, and behind her she could hear the quiet sounds of her council members weeping in the various ways. Their species expressed grief. We do not know if anyone will receive this message, and we do not know if anyone who receives it will care about the fate of strangers, and we have nothing to offer in return for help because everything we built is already destroyed, and we accept that we will likely die here. But if there is anyone out there who believes that civilization should stand against extinction, then please know that we called out into the darkness, and we hoped that someone would answer the message transmitted outward at light speed and behind it. Rishala sent all of their historical records and cultural databases and everything that might let some future species know that the Concordance had existed and had tried to build something beautiful before the universe crushed them for 3 hours. Nothing happened except the steady decline of their shield strength, and the Krethics vessels maintained their positions in a perfect sphere around Thalsera and waited with the patience of beings that knew their victory was inevitable. The council chamber had gone quiet, except for the soft alarms that marked each shield layer failing, and Rishala had begun composing a final message to be transmitted to the shelters below when the communications console erupted with activity. Speaker, we are receiving a response, the communications officer shouted, and his voice cracked with something that might have been hope if hope had not already died hours ago from the Krethiks? Rishala asked. No speaker from somewhere else in the translation. Matrix cannot make sense of it because the language is completely unknown to our databases. The officer routed the message to the main speakers. What filled the command center was a sound unlike anything Rishala had ever heard. It was harsh and aggressive and full of consonants that seemed designed to be shouted across vast distances or through hostile environments, and even through the confusion of an imperfect translation, the meaning came through clearly Viridian concordance. This is Terran Defense Command Vessel Indomitable responding to your distress call, and we read your situation, and we are inbound to your position at maximum speed. A pause. And then the voice continued with what sounded almost like humor, though Rishala could not imagine what could be humorous about their situation. Hold your position and keep those shields up as long as you can, because we are coming in hot and you are going to want to clear some space around your orbital city, another voice cut in, and this one carried more authority and spoke with clipped precision. Concordance Forces, this is Admiral Katri, commanding the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, and we show hostile contacts in orbit around your position, and we will arrive in your system in approximately 47 hours, and I need you to maintain defensive operations until we arrive, and do not surrender, and do not allow boarding, and stay alive until we get there. The transmission ended, and the command center erupted into chaos as multiple council members tried to speak at once and demanded to know who or what Terrans were and whether this was some kind of Krethik's trick. Rishala held up her hand for silence, and her mind raced through the implications of what they had just heard. Someone had answered, and someone was coming, and someone with military designations and fleet numbers that suggested they actually understood warfare. How long until the shields fail completely? She asked. Kalsith checked his displays, and his expression became even more grim, if that was possible. 5 hours and 17 minutes. Speaker Rishala looked at the display showing the Krethik's vessels, holding position around them like predators waiting for their prey to stop struggling. The Terrans had said 47 hours, and they needed to survive for 42 hours longer than their shields would last. It should have been impossible, but for the first time since the Krethiks had appeared in concordant space, Rishala felt something other than despair. She felt the terrible, fragile possibility that perhaps the universe was not entirely empty of help, after all. The shields had failed 3 hours ago, and the Krethiks vessels had moved into bombardment formation when space itself seemed to tear open just above Thalsara's orbital path. Rishala watched the sensors go completely insane as 27 massive contacts appeared where nothing had existed a moment before, and the energy readings were so high that the displays actually shut down to prevent overload. No species in known space performed faster than light transitions that close to a gravity. Well, because the mathematics required were impossibly complex in the slightest error would tear a ship apart at the molecular level. Terran fleet had just done exactly that, and their ships emerged from FTL at what the Concordance tactical computers classified as suicide range. The vessels themselves looked wrong, and that was Rishala's first thought as the visual feeds finally resolved into clear images where Concordance ships were elegant and curved and designed to minimize their profile. The Terran vessels were brutal slabs of armor and weapons that looked like they had been built with the single purpose of taking damage and delivering it back tenfold. Largest ship sat at the center of the formation, and it was easily 3 times the size of anything in the Concordance fleet, and its hull was scarred with old impact craters and burn marks that spoke of battles survived through sheer toughness rather than avoidance. All Concordance vessels, this is the TDFS Indomitable, and you need to break orbit immediately. Get clear of the combat zone, and we are going weapons free in 30 seconds. The voice was Admiral Katri, and it carried no room for argument. The 12 remaining Concordance defense ships began burning away from Thalsara as fast as their engines could push them, and Rishala ordered the orbital city to activate its emergency thrusters to gain any distance they could from what was about to happen. The Krethik swarm reacted with their usual coordination, and 68 vessels turned as one to face the new threat, and their weapons began charging with the kind of power that had destroyed entire Concordance fleets. The Terrans did not wait for them to fire first. The Indomitable launched what looked like hundreds of missiles in the first volley, and they spread out in a pattern that no Concordance tactical officer would have approved because it left. Massive gaps in the coverage, then the missiles started dodging and weaving with independent intelligence, and Rishala realized they were not simple projectiles, but autonomous weapons that hunted their targets with predatory focus. Krethek's point defense systems managed to destroy perhaps half of them, but the rest slammed home and detonated. With yields that registered off the scale of Concordance sensors, what are those warheads? Kalsith whispered as he watched 3 Krethek's cruisers simply cease to exist in balls of fusion fire before anyone could answer the rest of the Terran fleet. Opened fire, and space became a storm of weapons that the Concordance had never imagined could exist, or guns that fired projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed and laser. Batteries that could maintain continuous beams instead of the pulsed fire that Concordance energy weapons required, and something that looked like it was throwing chunks of superheated plasma directly at enemy ships. The Kretheks returned fire with their own devastating weapons, and their beams tore through space toward the Terran fleet with energies that should have vaporized anything they touched. The Terran ships took the hits head-on, and their shields flared with colors that hurt to look at, but they did not break, and they did not retreat, and they did not even slow down. Impossible. The Luminate Council member resonated, and her voice carried harmonics of complete disbelief. Nothing can withstand that kind of sustained fire, but the Terrans could, and they were already accelerating toward the Krethek's formation at speeds that should have liquefied their crews from the G-forces involved. Admiral Katrea's voice cut through the chaos again, and this time, Rishala could hear something in it that sent chills through her body. It was not fear, and it was not even really anger, but rather a cold professional focus that suggested the Admiral had done this many times before. All ships execute pattern Delta 7 and Cruiser Squadron, break their left flank, and carrier groups launch all fighters. Now the Terran formation split apart with practiced precision, and 3 cruisers broke away from the main group and curved around the Krethek's position at an angle that would put them behind the enemy. Fleet smaller craft began pouring out of 2 of the larger vessels, and Rishala realized those were fighter craft, except they were moving with acceleration curves that would kill any Concordance pilot instantly. The Kretheks tried to reform to address the multiple threat vectors, but the Terrans were not fighting like any opponent the swarm had faced before. They did not maintain safe distances or try to preserve their ships or follow any of the logical tactical approaches that species developed when they valued the lives of their crew members. Instead, they pressed in close and closer still until some of the Terran vessels were fighting at ranges where weapons fire from one ship could potentially damage friendly vessels. The Terran destroyer took a direct hit that blew through its forward shields and tore a massive hole in its bow section, and the crew simply vented the damaged compartments to space and kept fighting with what weapons they had left. The Indomitable itself charged directly into the center of the Krethek's formation, and its guns never stopped firing, even as enemy beams carved glowing scars across its armor plating. Then Admiral Katre did something that made every Concordance officer watching forget how to breathe. The Indomitable lined up on a Krethek's heavy cruiser, and instead of firing or turning away, it simply accelerated directly toward the enemy vessel at maximum thrust. "He not mean to ram them," Rishala said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew that was exactly what the Admiral intended, though. Krethek's cruiser tried to evade, but it was too slow, and the Indomitable was too fast and too committed, and the 2 ships came together. With an impact that registered on Thalsera seismic sensors despite being in orbital space, the Terran dreadnoughts' reinforced prow smashed through the Kretheks vessel's midline and kept going, and tore the enemy ship into 2 pieces that tumbled away, spilling atmosphere and debris. The Indomitable emerged from the other side of the collision, trailing fire from a dozen hull breaches, but every weapon that could still bear was firing at new targets before the debris had even finished scattering. "Admiral!" Status report. Admiral Katre's voice came through on the open channel, and it sounded slightly strained, but not at all panicked, despite having just deliberately crashed her ship into an enemy vessel. "Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12, Admiral, and we have lost primary starboard weapons and engineering reports. The main reactor is running hot, but stable, acceptable, and maintain current heading, and prepare to fire the main gun on my mark." The Indomitable's bow began to glow with a blue-white light that built in intensity. It didn't until it hurt to look at directly, and then a lance of pure energy shot out and speared through to Krethik's vessels that had made the mistake of lining up in the same firing solution. The battle continued for another hour, and it was not graceful or elegant or any of the things that Concordance military theorists had written about in their ancient texts. It was brutal and efficient and absolutely merciless. And when the Krethiks finally broke formation and began trying to retreat, the Karen fighters pursued them and made sure that not a single enemy vessel escaped back into FTLWHEN. The last Krethik ship finally died. The Terran fleet immediately shifted priorities with the same smooth coordination they had shown in combat. All ships begin search and rescue operations, and I want combat engineers on every damaged Concordance vessel now, and medical teams prepare to receive casualties from multiple species. Rishala realized. She was shaking, and around her the command center was completely silent except for the sound of various species trying to process what they had just witnessed. The Terrans had won, and they had won so decisively that the Krethik swarm that had destroyed the Concordance over 6 months had been broken in just over an hour, and now the same vessels that had been dealing death with casual efficiency were moving among the damaged Concordance ships and gently pulling survivors from wrecked hulls with the same intensity they had shown in combat speaker. We are receiving a transmission from Admiral Ketri, the communications officer said, and his voice still carried shock. Rishala straightened herself and tried to find the words to thank these beings who had traveled across space to save complete strangers. Council speaker Rishala, Admiral Ketrea's voice came through, and this time it carried something that might have been gentle, if gentleness could exist in someone who had just deliberately rammed an enemy warship. We are going to need a full casualty report from your forces and engineering assessments of any vessels that can be salvaged, and I am also going to need somewhere to dock the Indomitable, because we took more damage than I would prefer, and my crew could use a hot meal and some actual rest. The Admiral paused, and when she spoke again there was something in her voice that Rishala would remember for the rest of her life. You held position just like I asked, and you kept your people alive until we could get here, and that took courage, and I want you to know that you did well. Rishala tried to respond, but found that her voice would not work properly, so she simped. The Terran Marines came through the airlock of the damaged Concordance medical ship like a force of nature, contained in armor, and Rishala watched them move with a combination of fascination and primal fear. Each human stood roughly twice the height of a Viridian, and their armor added bulk that made them look like walking tanks, and their weapons were larger than anything Concordant soldier could have lifted with both hands. Ma'am, I am Gunnery Sergeant Chen, and my team is here to secure this vessel and extract any survivors, the lead Marine said, and even through the helmet speakers, Rishala could hear that this was someone who expected to be obeyed. The medical ship had been holed in 3 places during the Krethik's attack, and half the crew was dead, and the other half was trapped in sealed compartments with failing life support. The Concordance rescue teams had tried for 6 hours to cut through the collapsed bulkheads, but their tools were designed for careful, precise work and not the kind of emergency breaching that the situation required. Sergeant Chen looked at the blocked corridor for perhaps 5 seconds before turning to her team. Rodriguez, bring up the thermal lance, and Kowalski, I want shape charges on those support beams, and we are going to peel this open like a food container. What followed was controlled violence applied with surgical precision, and the Terrans cut through reinforced bulkheads that had taken Concordance engineers years to design and install. The thermal lance burned at temperatures that made Rishala seat sensors simply give up and display error messages, and the shaped charges detonated with carefully calculated yields that destroyed the obstacles without collapsing the surrounding structure. Within 20 minutes, the Terrans had opened a path to the trapped survivors and were pulling them out with a gentleness that seemed impossible from beings who moved with such aggressive confidence. One of the rescued Concordance crew members was a Lumine who had been trapped in a compartment that had lost atmosphere, and her crystalline body had multiple fractures from explosive decompression. We need medical assistance here, Sergeant Chen called, and another Marine moved forward with equipment that looked nothing like Concordance medical technology. Ma'am, I am Corman Davis, and I need you to stay still while I stabilize those fractures." The human said to the Luminae, and his voice carried the kind of calm that medical professionals use to keep patients from panicking. "Your biology is completely different from mine." The Luminae resonated weakly. "How can you possibly know how to treat my injuries? We have your species' medical database from the files. You transmitted with your distress call, and I have been studying Luminae physiology for the past 40 hours straight. And I know it is not ideal, but I know enough to keep you alive until we can get you to proper medical facilities." The corpsman worked with tools adapted on the fly to handle crystalline biology and applied treatments that combined Concordance medical knowledge with human emergency response doctrine. Within minutes, the Luminae's resonance had stabilized and her internal light had brightened to something closer to healthy levels. This same scene was playing out across a dozen damaged Concordance vessels as Terran Marines and engineers swarmed through wrecks that the Concordance had given up as lost causes in one of the defense ships. A Terran team found the entire crew trapped in an engineering section that had been sealed when the reactor containment had failed. The radiation levels were high enough to kill most concordant species in hours, and the survivors had been slowly dying while their rescue teams stood helpless outside. The Terrans simply put on heavier armor and walked through radiation that made their suits' warning systems scream in protest, and they carried out every single survivor. And only afterward did Rishala learn that 2 of the Marines had taken enough radiation exposure to require immediate medical treatment. "Why did they risk themselves for our people?" Rishala asked Admiral Ketri during one of their briefings, and the question came out more blunt than she had intended. The Admiral looked at her with eyes that were a shade of brown that seemed to shift between warm and cold, depending on the light. And her expression was thoughtful, because they could, and because your people needed help, and because that is what we do, Katri said simply. "But the risk to your own crew members," Rishala pressed. "It's acceptable when weighed against the certainty of death for yours, and we have treatments for radiation exposure. And your people did not, and the mathematics of the situation were clear." The Admiral pulled up a display showing the current status of rescue operations, and the numbers were staggering. Over 3,000 Concordant survivors had been pulled from situations that would have been classified as unrecoverable by their own damage control protocols. "I do not understand how your people can function in these conditions." Rishala admitted. "Your Marines work in vacuum without hesitation, and your engineers enter contaminated zones that should kill them, and your pilots fly maneuvers that should render them unconscious from acceleration stress." Katri smiled, and it was not a happy expression, but rather something that acknowledged a truth. That was both terrible and practical. "Council Speaker, has anyone explained to you what kind of planet humanity evolved on?" Rishala shook her head, and the Admiral pulled up a file that made the Concordance databases. "Classify Earth as a Class 12. Hazard World, our homeworld, sits in what we call the Goldilocks zone, but that is a pleasant name for a planet that tried to kill us at every stage of our evolution. Katri began. Earth has weather systems that can level cities and temperature, ranges that span from frozen wastelands to burning deserts, and an atmosphere composition that would be toxic to most species you have encountered." The Admiral highlighted different sections of the file as she continued. "We have predators that can outrun us and outclimb us and outswim us, and we survive by being tougher and more adaptable and more willing to use tools and cooperation than anything else that wanted to eat us." Rishala looked at images of Earth's wildlife and felt her survival instincts screaming at her to flee from creatures that looked like they had been designed specifically to end life. "Our bodies developed redundant organs so that we could survive injuries that would kill other species immediately, and our immune systems treat everything as a potential threat because our world was full of diseases and parasites and toxins." "Your planet sounds like a nightmare," Rishala said quietly. "It was home," Katri replied, "and it made us very good at surviving things that should kill us, and that translated well to space travel because space is just another hostile environment trying to kill us in new and interesting ways." The Admiral closed the file and looked directly at Rishala with an intensity that made the Concordant speaker resist the urge to step backward. "The Krethiks attacked one of our colony worlds 4 years ago, and they killed 80,000 humans before we could mount a defense, and we have been hunting them ever since. Is that why? You answered our distress call, Rishala asked, because you wanted revenge. No, Petrie said, and her voice carried absolute certainty. We answered your call because you asked for help, and because we were close enough to respond, and because allowing genocide to continue when we have the power to stop it is not something humans can do, and still call ourselves civilized. The Admiral pulled up a tactical display showing the system they were currently in, and the surrounding space the Krethix. We'll regroup, and they will return, and when they do, we will need to be ready, because they do not accept defeat. And they do not stop expanding until something makes them stop. The Concordance has no military strength left, Rishala said and hated. How defeated the word sounded, then we will teach you. Katri replied, not how to be warriors, because I do not think your people want that, but how to survive and how to fight when survival demands it, and how to make the cost of attacking you high enough that predators look for easier prey. The Admiral stood and offered her hand in what Rishala had learned was a human gesture of agreement and partnership. The Krethix think they can consume everything they encounter, and they are wrong. And we are going to teach them that lesson, and you are going to help us do it. Rishala took the offered hand and felt the strength in the Admiral's grip, and understood for the first time that help had not arrived in the form of saviors who would solve all their problems. Help had arrived in the form of allies who would stand beside them and teach them how to be strong enough to save themselves outside. The viewport, the Terran fleet continued its work, and damaged ships were being repaired, and survivors were being treated, and defensive positions were being established. Humans moved with the confidence of people who had looked at the hostile universe and decided that they belonged here anyway, and they would defend their right to exist against anything that disagreed. Rishala watched them work and felt something shift in her understanding of what civilization could be. Perhaps survival did not mean avoiding conflict, and perhaps strength did not mean domination, and perhaps help could come from the most unexpected places in the form of people who evolved on nightmare worlds and decided that the right response to a hostile universe was defiance. The medical bay on the Indomitable was nothing like the sterile quiet spaces that the Concordance used for healing, and Rishala found herself overwhelmed by the organized chaos of humans treating casualties from multiple species. Corman Davis had invited her to observe so that she could understand how Tehran medical doctrine worked, and what she saw challenged everything she thought she knew. Vacuum for almost 3 minutes, and by all Concordance medical knowledge, should have been dead long before rescue arrived. Talk to me about what happened, the doctor said to her patient while her hands moved with practiced efficiency across equipment. That combined human technology with hastily adapted Concordance medical tools. The whole breach happened so fast the Viridian gasped, and his gills were moving erratically as his body tried to process oxygen properly again. I felt my lungs collapse, and my blood started to freeze, and everything went dark. But you held your breath like the safety briefings taught you, the doctor said, and it was not a question. And you kept your mouth closed, and you did not panic. I tried to reach the emergency shelter, but my body stopped working. Your body did exactly what it was supposed to do, and it shut down non-essential functions to preserve your core biology, and humans call that shock, and it kept you alive long enough for Sergeant Chen's team to pull you out. The doctor finished her work, and the Viridian's vital signs stabilized at levels that the monitoring equipment marked as acceptable. Not optimal. You are going to be okay, and you will spend a few days recovering here and then. We will transfer you back to your people, and I want you to remember that you survived something that should have killed you, and that means you are tougher than you think." Rishala watched the doctor move to the next patient and marveled at the casual competence with which humans approached medical emergencies that would have sent concordance physicians into extended consultations with specialists. "How did you know how to save him?" Rishala asked. "Davis, your species breathes oxygen through lungs, but Viridians process water through gills, and the biology is completely different." Davis pulled up a display that showed comparative anatomy charts between humans and Viridians, with notes written in what looked like multiple human languages. "You are right that the mechanisms are different, but the principles are similar, and both our species need to exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide, and both our circulatory systems operate on pressure differentials, and both our bodies respond to trauma. By trying to preserve critical functions, the corpsman highlighted sections of the anatomy that showed surprising similarities despite the obvious differences. When we received your distress call, Admiral Katri made sure every medical staff member got access to your biological databases, and we spent the transit time learning everything we could about concordant species physiology. You learned 7 completely different biological systems in 2 days, Rishala said, and could not keep the disbelief from her voice. "We learned enough to keep people alive, and we will learn the rest as we go." Davis replied, "Human medicine developed on a world where we had to treat injuries from hundreds of different predators and diseases from thousands of different pathogens and environmental hazards that changed with every climate zone." The corpsman gestured around the medical bay where human staff were treating Luminae and Viridian and 4 other concordant species with adapted equipment. "An improvised technique's adaptability is humanity's survival trait, and we apply it to everything, including medicine and warfare and engineering and every other field where flexibility means the difference between life and death." Over the following days, Rishala spent time observing different sections of the Terran fleet, and each experience reinforced how fundamentally different humans were from every species. The concordance had encountered in the engineering section. She watched a human technician named Rodriguez repair a concordance power conduit that had been damaged in the battle. Conduit operated on principles that human technology did not use and required tools that the Enerons did not carry and should have taken days to fix properly. Rodriguez looked at the problem for 10 minutes and then proceeded to build a custom repair tool using spare parts from 3 different systems and fixed the conduit in under 2 hours. "How did you know that would work?" Rishala asked as she watched the power flow stabilize. "I did not know for certain," Rodriguez admitted, "but I understood the principles of what the conduit needed to do. I had materials that could theoretically accomplish those goals, and I was willing to try things until something worked. What if your attempt had failed? Then I would have tried something else, and humans are very good at learning from failure. Because our evolution punished species that could not adapt and rewarded species that could try new approaches when old ones stopped working." In the Combat Information Center, she observed how Terran tactical doctrine operated, and it was simultaneously more aggressive and more protective than anything in Concordance. Military Theory Commander Singh was running training scenarios with Concordance Defense Force officers, and his approach was blunt in a way that made several of the trainees visibly uncomfortable. "Your defensive formations are designed to minimize casualties, but they also minimize your ability to actually stop an attacker," Singh said as he pulled up a tactical display showing a typical Concordance defensive posture. "We prefer to avoid unnecessary death," one of the Concordance officers replied. "Death is always unnecessary when you are the one dying," Singh agreed, "but allowing an enemy to dictate the terms of engagement because you are afraid of taking risks means you will lose slowly instead of quickly, and the result is the same." The commander reset the scenario and showed an alternative approach. Terran doctrine prioritizes ending threats as quickly as possible because the longer a battle continues, the more opportunities exist for things to go wrong, and we accept higher initial risk in exchange for faster resolution. He highlighted sections of the formation that would move to aggressive positions, while others provided covering fire and support. "This does not mean we throw lives away, but it means we understand that the purpose of combat is to make the enemy stop fighting, and everything else is secondary to that goal." One of the Concordance officers raised an objection that had been bothering Rishala since she first watched the Terrans fight. "Your people take damage that would destroy our ships, and you lose crew members in actions that we would consider too costly, and yet you claim to value life. Singh's expression became serious in a way that suggested this was not the first time he had answered this question. We value life enough to risk our own to protect others, and there is a difference between spending lives carelessly and accepting that some costs are worth paying. The commander pulled up casualty reports from the battle for Thalsera. We lost 37 crew members in that engagement, and another 62 are in medical care, and every single one of those losses hurts because they were our people and our friends and our family. Then why accept those casualties? The Concordance officer pressed, because the alternative was allowing 300,000 of your people to die, and the mathematics of that exchange are clear to us, even if they are uncomfortable. Singh closed the casualty reports and looked at each of the Concordance officers, in turn humans. Learned a long time ago that civilization requires people willing to stand between the innocent and harm, and we learned that lesson because our own history is full of times when no one stood and people died who should have lived that evening. Rishala met with Admiral Khatri in the Admiral's quarters and found them surprisingly sparse for someone who commanded an entire fleet. The only personal items visible were a few images of people who were presumably family or friends in a worn book that sat on the desk with pages marked by multiple bookmarks. You have been observing my crew, Khatri said, and it was not an accusation, but simple acknowledgement. I am trying to understand how humans think. Rishala admitted, because your people do things that seem impossible and operate under principles that contradict what the Concordance believed about civilization, such as you accept casualties that we would find unbearable, and you risk your lives for strangers, and you adapt to situations faster than should be possible, and you treat survival as something that can be achieved through determination rather than caution. Khatri poured 2 drinks from a container that held something amber-colored and offered one to Rishala, who accepted it cautiously. The Concordance built a civilization based on peace and cooperation and avoiding conflict. And those are admirable goals, the Admiral said. But they only work when everyone agrees to follow the same principles, and the Krethics do not, and neither do half a dozen other species that humanity has encountered. And the universe does not care about our preference for peace over conflict. Khatri took a drink, and Rishala tried hers and found it burned. In a way that was not entirely unpleasant, Earth taught humanity that survival requires adaptability and toughness and willingness to do difficult things when circumstances demand it. And we carried those lessons with us into space. Your world made you into warriors? The Krethics returned 3 weeks after their defeat at Thalsera, and this time they brought their main fleet with numbers that made the first battle look like a minor skirmish. 247 vessels dropped out of FTL at the edge of the system and began their methodical advance toward the orbital city that they had failed to destroy. Before Rishala stood in the command center, felt the old fear trying to return, but this time something was different, and the Concordance was different, and they were no longer facing annihilation alone. All Concordance vessels moved to defensive positions, and remember what Commander Singh taught you. Admiral Khatri's voice came through clearly on the command channel. We are going to make them regret coming back. The Concordance defense fleet had grown from 12 battered survivors to 40 vessels cobbled together from salvage and desperate repairs and crewed by people who had spent 3 weeks learning how Deathworlders thought about survival. They were not warriors, and they never would be, but they had learned that they did not need to be warriors to fight effectively. Viridian Squadron break left and draw their attention, Rishala commanded, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Lumine ships target their sensors with focused beam attacks and make them blind. The Concordance vessels moved with coordination that would have been impossible before humans arrived and taught them that survival sometimes required accepting risk instead of avoiding it. The Viridians used their ship's superior maneuverability to dart between Krethics vessels and force the enemy to split their attention across multiple threat vectors. The Lumine channeled their natural ability to manipulate light into concentrated beams that burned out Krethic sensor arrays and disrupted their hive mind coordination. It was not human-level aggression, but it was no longer the passive defense that had failed. so catastrophically before the Terran fleet sat in reserve and waited with the patience of predators who knew their moment would come. "They are adapting to our tactics," Calcith reported as the Krethix formation began to compensate for the concordance. "Harassment they're targeting is improving, and they are focusing fire on our most aggressive ships." "Then we switched tactics," Rishala said, and she pulled up the command interface that Commander Singh had spent hours teaching her to use all. "Concordance. Vessels fall back to secondary positions, and Terran fleet, you are cleared to engage." Finally, someone said over the Terran command channel, and it carried the tone of someone who had been waiting impatiently for permission to do what they had been trained for. Human warships surged forward, and the Krethix hive mind must have recognized them, because the enemy formation immediately began adapting to deal with the threat they had encountered before. But the Krethix were fighting the last battle, and the Terrans had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment. "Execute Operation Sledgehammer," Admiral Katri ordered, and her voice carried grim satisfaction. Terran fleet split into 3 groups that moved with coordination that looked like chaos, until Rishala saw the pattern and realized it was brilliance. The first group engaged the Krethix head-on with the kind of aggressive, close-range fighting that had worked so well in the previous battle, and the enemy committed forces to counter them. The second group curved around the flank in a maneuver the Krethix had seen before and prepared for. By shifting their defensive positions, the third group did something the Krethix had not anticipated and dropped back into FTL for a micro-jump that brought them out directly behind the enemy formation at point-blank range. The Krethix had been preparing for another ramming attack, or perhaps massed missile fire, but instead, the Terran ships that emerged from behind carried something different. All vessels fired the Nova cannons Admiral Katri commanded. Weapons that the Terrans had been building in secret for 3 weeks, discharged with energies that made normal ship weapons look like children's toy sticks. Beams of coherent energy lanced through space, and each one punched through multiple Krethix ships like they were made of paper instead of Armatha. Hive mind coordination that made the Krethix so dangerous suddenly became a catastrophic weakness, as the destruction of key vessels cascaded through their formation and disrupted command and control across entire sections of their fleet. "All forces press the attack now," Katri ordered. "Do not give them time to recover the concordant ships." Moved back into engagement range, and this time they fought alongside the Terrans with tactics adapted to their strengths. Viridian vessels used their maneuverability to herd damaged Krethix ships into kill zones where Terran weapons could finish. The Illuminae ships created light patterns that mimicked weapon signatures and drew enemy fire away from more vulnerable allies. Smaller concordant species that had never considered themselves capable of combat found roles in electronic warfare. In damage control and logistics, support. It was not elegant, and it was not the kind of peaceful civilization the concordants had built, but it was effective, and more importantly, it was working then. Battle raged for 6 hours, and this time, when the Krethix tried to retreat, they found their escape routes blocked by concordant ships that had learned the value of preventing enemies from regrouping. The hive mind made one final desperate push toward Stalsera, and threw everything it had left in a suicide attack that should have overwhelmed the defenders through pure mass. Instead, it ran into Admiral Katri and the Indomitable sitting directly in their path with every weapon charged and ready. "I have been waiting for you," the Admiral said conversationally over the open channel. "Did you think we would forget what you did to Proxima Station?" The Indomitable opened fire with weapons that had been designed specifically to kill Krethix vessels, and the Dreadnought's guns never stopped firing as it waded into the enemy formation like an avenging angel made of steel and fury around it. The rest of the Terran fleet provided support and eliminated any enemy vessel that tried to flank their flagship. The concordant ships formed a protective screen and ensured that no Krethix vessel escaped to carry information about human capabilities back to the greater swarm. When the last enemy ship finally died, the system fell silent except for the background noise of damaged vessels. An emergency transmission looked at the casualty reports and felt her heart sink at the losses. 17 concordant ships destroyed and another 23 damaged beyond immediate repair, and over 2,000 crew members dead or injured. It was catastrophic by concordant standards, But it was also a victory we held, Kalsith said quietly beside her. We actually held against their main fleet. We did more than hold Rishala, replied. We won. The command center erupted in celebration. That mixed relief and grief and exhausted triumph. Admiral Catrius' face appeared on the main display, and the human looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Council Speaker Rishala, I am pleased to report that the Krethix fleet has been neutralized, and we are beginning recovery operations, and I would like to request a meeting at your earliest convenience. Of course, Admiral, and I believe I speak for the entire Concordance when I say that we owe you a debt we can never fully repay. Katri smiled, and it was gentle in a way that seemed wrong on someone who had just led a battle that killed thousands. You owe us nothing except the promise that you will remember what you learned here. The meeting took place 3 days later in a conference chamber that had been hastily repaired after the battle, and representatives from all 7 Concordant species attended, along with human military and civilian leadership. The Krethix will return, Admiral Ketri began. Without preamble, perhaps not tomorrow or next year, but they will return because expansion is their nature. And they do not accept defeat in ways that other species understand. Then what do we do? Rishala asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. We make sure you are ready, and we build an alliance that can stand against them, and we teach other species what you have learned here. Commander Singh pulled up star charts, showing the region of space between human and Concordance territory. There are 47 inhabited systems in this region, and most of them are peaceful species that have never faced serious military threats, and the Krethix expansion will reach them eventually. You want us to warn them? One of the Luminae representatives resonated. We want to offer them a choice, Katri corrected, so they can prepare and learn to defend themselves and join an alliance of species committed to mutual protection, or they can wait and hope the Krethix never find them, and if they choose not to join, then we respect their choice and we move on, and we do not abandon them if they call for help later. Rishala looked at the star charts and saw dozens of civilizations that might face what the Concordance had faced, and she thought about what it would mean to prevent even one species from experiencing that terror. What would this alliance require from us? Admiral Katri stood, and her expression became formal in a way that suggested this was a moment that would define everything that came after. The Terran Federation proposes the formation of the Deathworld Compact, and it would be a mutual defense alliance between humanity and any species willing to commit to defending each other against existential threats.